It's the Roaring '20s. The country is flourishing. Some African-American communities are prospering, like the residents of Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma. A remarkable Baptist pastor named Solomon Sir Jones is the pioneering filmmaker. His footage was lost for more than 50 years. Jones captures the bustling life of Greenwood, which could be any American small town. But Tulsa's whites don't like what they see. In May 1921, after a black man is accused of assaulting a white woman, a white mob rampages through the city. For a night and a day, they loot and burn Greenwood. A Fox News crew captures the only surviving footage. It is the bloodiest racial massacre in American history, leaving nearly 300 dead.
By secret paths and waterways, Tubman did lead dozens of slaves to freedom. But her experience also made her a valuable military asset.
The skills she gained as a young woman in terms of the ability to, go in the woods and travel in strange places translates into very useful skills for the Union Army.
In 1863, the Union command sent her deep behind enemy lines in South Carolina to lay the groundwork for a daring plantation raid.
She goes inland into South Carolina and establishes relationships with local people.
On the night of June 2nd, she planned a covert operation on the Combahee River. As dawn broke, they took 3 plantations by surprise. Tubman gave a signal, and the enslaved people rushed to freedom. They burned storehouses and destroyed crops, crippling supply lines. One Confederate captain fumed, their success was complete.
On the eve of D-Day, Julian Bud Rice flies an unarmored C-47, carrying 21 paratroopers across the English Channel and into a barrage of enemy fire.
You could see the anti-flak burst coming from the ground and the tracer bullets coming up. It was almost impossible to avoid everything, so you were lucky just to take some machine gun fire.
Your 6-minute warning, rise and shine!
As his C-47 enters the drop zone 5 miles from the French coast, 21-year-old Don Jakeway prepares for the most terrifying moment of his young life.
The jump master stood there in the door.
Hey, go, go, go!
And if you froze in the door, he had orders to shoot you.
1, 2.
When we jumped, the bullets were going up. You could hear the zit, like going through your chute. You know the Germans are there, and the moment you jump in as a paratrooper, you're surrounded and scared to death.
821 C-47s fly in the first wave. Astonishingly, all but 21 of them deliver their human cargo to the drop zone and return home safe, including Bud Rice.
I was very fortunate. I came back safe and sound.
Louisville, home of the Kentucky Derby, where Secretariat, one of the greatest racehorses of all time, made his name. In 1973, he won the Triple Crown after blasting through the Kentucky Derby, the Preakness, and the Belmont Stakes.
Secretariat left no doubt. He was a horse that left absolutely no doubt as to how good he was. Anatomically, he was something by Da Vinci. He was unanimously acclaimed as America's Horse of the Year. And he had all this ability and all these looks, and he had a gorgeous owner, Penny. And there's Ron Turcotte, the Canadian, who had finally sat on a horse that he could say, this is the best horse I've ever been on. They're all waiting for him to run in all of these races for the Triple Crown.
It had been since 1948, since we'd had a Triple Crown winner. So you get to 73, people are looking for a hero.
But his spectacular rise came after a dramatic scare.
And it looks like he's going to go sailing into the Kentucky Derby, undefeated in 1973, when he developed an abscess on his upper lip, and he finished third in the Wood Memorial. Ran horribly, and it plunged everybody into this mass confusion. What has happened to the $6 million horse?
Blacks had the same dreams, the same aspirations, the same love of flight, but they were barred for social reasons, had never cast a long shadow.
Out of this shadow stepped Bessie Coleman.
Bessie Coleman is a dreamer, and she's a risk taker.
She was born in 1892, before airplanes and long before equality.
Bessie Coleman was born in poverty to a large family in Texas.
As she was growing up, the dream of flight went from fantasy to reality. Despite her background, she was compelled to pursue it herself.
She was a manicurist, but she decided she loved the idea and the adventure of flying.
No one in the United States would train a young black woman to fly. But France had a world-renowned flight school that was more welcoming, if she could get there.
So she would work during the day at a chili parlor just to raise enough money for her travels to France, and at night she would teach herself French.
She raised money she didn't have, learned a language she didn't know, and earned an international pilot's license in 1921.
She's the first African-American woman with a license to fly.
And this was a real benchmark, not only for her race, but also for her gender.
Bessie Coleman is this amazing, strong individual who wouldn't take no for an answer.
With her pilot's license in hand, Coleman returned to an America fascinated with flight. Daredevil flight.
In the 1920s, barnstorming was a fascinating and exciting form of aviation where stunt pilots would go up and they do all types of tricks and aerobatics in their aircraft.
Barnstorming was part circus, part sport. Pilots competed for attention by pushing their planes to the limit. Bessie Coleman was no different, except she looked different.
Bessie Coleman, sitting behind the wheel of the plane, was a sight to be seen.
She was a small little woman, you know, but she'd go up in that aircraft and she'd do her loops and her flips and, you know, recover from stalls at the very bottom and blow everybody away.
There was no one like her. There was no one who had this internationally recognized flying license and at the same time was a young black woman.
And for a blazingly short time, she was the most extraordinary woman in American culture, particularly for African Americans.
I've always been fascinated by Lizzie Borden. She's part of American folklore, her story known to every child here, with its own grisly skipping rope rhyme. We can all recite along. Lizzie Borden took an axe, gave her father 40 whacks, and when she saw what she had done, she gave her mother 41. The rhyme is unambiguous. Lizzie murdered her father and mother, in fact her stepmother, and she did it in the most gruesome way imaginable, with an axe.
Lizzie Borden ticks all the boxes of conventional upper middle class femininity. She is a church-going woman. She even teaches a Sunday school class. And the thought that she would so brutally kill her father and her stepmother seemed almost unbelievable. But she seemed oddly composed for someone who had discovered such a tragedy. And that coolness was thought to be suspicious by the police and by many others.
Against all odds, as the investigation gathers pace, Lizzie becomes the prime suspect. Her evidence at the Borden's inquest is her downfall.
In the inquest, where Lizzie Borden was not represented by counsel, she gave inconsistent answers as to her whereabouts that day. She couldn't remember if she was upstairs, if she was in the barn. She had different answers depending on when the question was asked. Because of that, she said some things that made people think, well, she must be guilty.
At the close of the inquest, Lizzie is arrested and incarcerated in the county jail. Fall River is in shock. Surely a gentle woman of Lizzie's standing could not have committed these brutal murders.
On the 20th of January 1936, Edward's father, King George V, died. Queen Mary took her son's hand and kissed it. He'd had 40 years to prepare himself for this day, but it had merely been 40 years dreading it. The now King Edward VIII burst into tears.
The heavy burden of kingship was now on Edward's shoulders, but his reign was about to be short and controversial. Now he was king, Edward was determined to make the most of it. He planned to make his reign different from those that had gone before. He'd be open to new ideas, progressive, willing to make changes. The more traditional regime of his father was over. His own reign was to be a more modern reflection of the times. But such a modern attitude, combined with a more informal approach, would make his a controversial reign.
One of my favourite stories, which I think epitomises Edward VIII's new approach, concerns the clocks at Sandringham. Since the reign of Edward VII, they'd always been set half an hour fast. It was known as Sandringham time and was done to give him more evening daylight for hunting. But shortly after his father's death, Edward VIII ordered that they be put back to the correct time. That seems to make sense. It must have been pretty confusing having a state in its own time zone. But it was also a tradition. And in the royal household, tradition has sometimes mattered more than common sense. Edward VIII was ripping up the rule book and ruffling feathers from day one.
In January 1937, FDR begins his second term. The nation's production, profits, and wages are rising back to pre-crash levels. Unemployment is at its lowest since he took office. The country is coming back to life. But FDR can't take all the credit. They say behind every great man is an even greater woman. Roosevelt is no different. In 1905, he married Eleanor Roosevelt, a distant cousin. Now, 32 years later, they have 5 children and 7 grandchildren. Eleanor is vital to FDR's vision for America. She is his eyes, ears, and legs on the ground. transforming the role of First Lady from hostess to stateswoman. She fights for the oppressed and forgotten. After extensive lobbying by Eleanor, FDR sets up the National Youth Administration.
Those who are not employed will need more than they have needed before. Their skills have completely gone.
The new agency helps American boys and girls stay in school and get vocational training. And thanks to Eleanor, it includes African Americans who have been failed by the New Deal.
This is a watch that Helen Keller used.
Helen Keller was born in Alabama in 1880, the daughter of a former Confederate officer.
How old is she in this photo?
She lost her sight and her hearing at the age of 19 months and grew up in a silent world of complete darkness. When Helen was 6 years old, Alexander Graham Bell led the Kellers to Annie Sullivan, who taught young Helen to communicate. To Amanda, Keller's story has special meaning.
My parents are deaf. My house was the house with the flashing lights when the telephone rang and the doorbell rang, and people thought it was really cool, and I just thought it was annoying. I know a lot of people didn't think my parents could have a child. They're like, oh, they're never gonna be able to raise a hearing child because they can't hear when she cries, they can't hear when she gets burped. You know, they had a system where when I would cry, my dog would get up and go wake up my mom, and my mom would know, oh, the baby's crying. Like all these little things that people take for granted and are so in tune to, my parents had to fight for it.
115 years ago, Helen Keller had to fight too.
People told her she could never go to college. There was a lot of skepticism that anyone could do anything in that day. And she demonstrated that
it's possible.
It is possible, yeah.
As an adult, Keller would not let her disabilities or the skeptics hold her back. She learned to read Braille and use a typewriter, then authored over a dozen books and became the first deaf and blind person to earn a college degree. She was also a social activist, campaigning for labor unions, women's rights, and the NAACP, and in 1920 she was a founding member of the American Civil Liberties Union. From the age of 12, everything she did, everywhere she went, the watch went with her.
We know that she had it with her in the early 1950s because she lost it. She left it in a taxi cab. The watch had significant sentimental value to her. Yeah. So there was an all-points bulletin to recover this watch, and it turned up in a pawn shop.
Wow.
And she got it back.
It's an ordinary thing to own a watch, and Helen Keller yearned for an ordinary life, but ended up with much more.
She's a hero to a lot of people because she overcame so many obstacles, and people kept telling her, oh, this girl's not gonna amount to anything, and yet she was an icon for so many people with disabilities.
Mark Siegel was 18 when he moved away from his family in 1969 and came to Greenwich Village, a well-known bohemian district in New York City.
When I was 18 years old, I knew I was gay, but I didn't even know what the right word for it was. And that was one of my hangouts, Stonewall. I would usually go to the end of the bar, and that's where my friends, street kids, drag queens, would hang out.
Most Stonewall customers were regularly harassed by the police.
We were second, third, fourth class citizens, but this place, allowed us to be here. We could be arrested out on the street. So this was safe.
On June 28, 1969, Mark had been in New York just 6 weeks.
So that night, I was in the bar, and all of a sudden, the lights started flickering on and off. I looked over the person next to me, I said, "What's going on?" And they were casual. They said, "Oh, just another raid." That set off alarm bells inside me. I was nervous as hell. And the police had no use for me. They're going after the drag queens. They're throwing insults around. But me, they just carted me and let me out. And I was glad to get out of the bar.
When Mark got outside, a small crowd was gathered around the entrance.
People were sort of applauding when someone got out. People started saying things to the police as the door would open. And the most vocal and loudest were the drag queens. They had nothing to lose. Stand up stronger. Everything society could take away from you had already taken away from them. This was their home. Somebody threw something at the door. Ruckus started. Police came out of the door chasing somebody. Then they went inside because they felt endangered. The police barricaded themselves inside the bar. Basically, all hell broke loose.
By the time police reinforcements arrived, Christopher Street had filled with several hundred people.
Police came out. People dispersed. People ran down that street. They ran up various other streets. Bleecker Street, Gay Street. They just were all over here. It was one of the greatest nights in the history for gay people.